Recall that the fragile wants tranquility, the anti-fragile grows from disorder, and the robust does not care too much. In January of 2019, Chinese leader Xi Jinping warned at a meeting of senior Communist Party leaders that China faces a series of major economic and political risks. Xi warned officials to be especially vigilant about the dangers of mental slackness, professional inadequacy, and the separation of the masses. Only a few months later, civil unrest shattered the city of Hong Kong, starting the biggest revolutionary movement in China since Tiananmen. This was not long after mainstream Western audiences learned about the internment camps in Xinjiang, China's predominantly ethnic Uyghur province, and not long before residents of Wuhan started to insult Communist Party leaders from the windows under quarantine. With or without this recent epidemic, Chinese society has started to rip at the seams. In the last entry of the 10,000, I explained the historic economic divisions of China and its effect on Chinese politics. In this entry, I will be explaining the overarching financial problems that will lead to the demise or reformation of the Chinese Communist Party. This is the 10,000. If you enjoy the content, like and subscribe to support the channel. In the 1980s, the United States was enthralled with an Asian nation on the other side of the Pacific, a country that, through their national resilience, unbelievably recovered from economic devastation and political collapse. It was a nation with a huge population, unending growth, and businesses that seemed like they could not possibly go bust. That nation was Japan. After the peace in the 1940s, like many nations recovering from the horrors of conflict, Japan was on a constant trajectory upwards. GDP growth was astronomically high, and by the late 1950s was reaching the mid-teens. Japan's opening and transformation into a market economy resulted in another true economic miracle, lifting 100 million people out of poverty. Soon, Japanese firms were not only competing with their American counterparts, but taking large parts of their market share. Much of this economic boom was credited to the business practices of the Japanese keiretsu, a handful of super-large conglomerations that dominated all aspects of the archipelago's economy. To get an idea of how big these conglomerations were, I'll give you an example that many of you might be familiar with. The Japanese Motor Vehicle Corporation, Mitsubishi. Except Mitsubishi doesn't just own Mitsubishi Motor Vehicle Corporation. They also own Mitsubishi Fuso Truck and Bus Corporation and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. And Honda. They own Nikon, Mitsubishi Real Estate, Mitsubishi Chemical, Mitsubishi Gas Chemical, Nippon Oil, Tokyo Broadcasting System, Fuji Sankai Communications Group, Mitsubishi Rayon, and Mitsubishi is also the largest bank in Japan. This incredibly large, diversified, and integrated corporate structure developed a system of patronage that we seldom see in American, Anglo, or Germanic capitalism. This system of patronage capitalism worked like a family unit. They supported and helped each other with cheap and easy cash, which gave the collective conglomerate a strategic advantage against competition. If there was a quarter when Sumitomo Metal Industries was not going to meet payroll, then Sumitomo Bank would provide its steel division with liquidity, or cash assets, at favorable and easily payable interest rates. Japanese capitalism became an economic system where social structure and patriarchal values were much more important than individual innovation and competition, because the keiretsu would have the resources to undercut and destroy any kind of small, although industrious, opposition. Liquidity not only became an asset, but a weapon that would ensure the sustainability of and tranquility in the conglomerate. This worked so well that American MBA students were being flown across the Pacific to learn Japan's business practices, as many thought they were superior. However, at the time, many in the business community didn't look for the source of this liquidity: the Japanese saver. The Japanese worker had a much higher rate of savings than their Western counterparts, about 3 to 4 times higher in the late 80s and early 90s. But unlike what most pundits would say at the time, it wasn't because of the cultural savviness of the Japanese worker that led them to save, it was because of the low interest rates and lack of pensions. When the Japanese worker would put their money in the post office, which doubled as a bank, the post office would only pay them low interest rates. This made it harder for the Japanese worker to accumulate capital and thereby forcing them to save more of their paycheck. More so, there was no public and minimal private pension plans for the Japanese worker. In order to retire, a worker must therefore save an even larger proportion of their paycheck. Japanese workers were not more frugal than their Western counterparts, they were just more desperate. However, this influx of savings was great for the keiretsu, as the Japanese government lent the vast amounts of wealth from the post office to these large conglomerates at cheap rates. It was cheap and easy cash, and the keiretsu got very, very drunk. In the early 90s, however, the keiretsu got a hangover. Japan's population started to shrink, the workers aged, and mass amounts of laborers retired. People who once saved their money in the post office started to withdraw it, causing cheap cash given to the keiretsu to dry up. The money that was too easily shared within the conglomerates turned from a strength to a weakness, as it shined a light on the normalized bad habits. The conglomerations could no longer make up for the division's problems. Japanese firms could no longer provide services under market price or meet payroll. Without the abundance of cheap money, the archipelago's economy started to learn discipline, and the lesson of discipline was cruel and harsh. In terms of the overall effect, Japan has never recovered. The size of Japan's economy was $5.4 trillion in 1994 and $5.1 trillion in 2019. This era of recovery was known as Japan's lost decade, and later its lost generation as the problems persisted. The thing about capitalism is that the social system does not care about familial ties, patronage, friendships, or social structure. It cares about ruthless competition, value added, and mathematical precision. Without the abundance of liquidity, the keiretsu, once touted as a great coalition of firms, was now seen as a clan of intertwining and binding inefficiencies. This is not a warning that the Chinese Communist Party heeded, and because it didn't heed this warning, China's economy will suffer exponentially worse. Besides being a Confucian culture with the same ideals of hierarchical structure as Japan, mainland China is not a country known for its business accountability. The number of scams, padded statistics, and specific asset bubbles cannot be adequately addressed in this video and can be found elsewhere on YouTube. Instead, I will be giving an overarching view of the trends of mainland China's economy. First, it is important to note, in terms of private credit, China's economy is the most overvalued in world history. In terms of non-institutional private lending, that is, lending from the private sector economy, not between banks, China has increased its line of credit by 5.5-fold within the past decade. That means since the financial crisis, Chinese debt on things from credit cards to corporate bonds has jumped from around $5 trillion to $27.5 trillion. That is undeniably too much, too quickly, and any system that has increased credit this much has faced a deep financial crisis. For comparison, the overabundance of credit that led to the US housing bubble in the 2000s was only a doubling of the total private credit, and the Eurozone crisis was only about a tripling. Even Japan's overextension of credit from the beginning of this video in the late 80s and early 90s that led to its lost decade was slightly better at about 5 times the extension of credit. China is already much worse than these catastrophic financial crises, and the People's Bank of China has not even begun its credit tightening. Financial crises tend to be the worst types of recessions. They aren't localized to one sector or industry, but tend to reverberate throughout the whole system. This is more so in China. According to an NPR report in November of 2019, the mainland Chinese economy has gotten into a credit structure so interweaved and intertangled that it has become immensely fragile. Not only are the corporations being constantly bailed out by the government, but their liabilities are on the balance sheets of the only corporations that are solvent and profitable. In essence, the debt of corporations that are constantly unprofitable are being paid by corporations that are profitable. This means that enough of these unprofitable corporations are unable to pay their debts, the firms that are productive can eventually become insolvent as well. This problem is exacerbated by the Chinese Communist Party's investment into strategic industries. In China, vast parts of the economy are considered strategic and are thus given money by the Chinese government. Many in the US and other Western countries fear the short-term advantages that companies like Huawei and Tencent obtain because of this government investment. However, like the liquidity provided to the Japanese keiretsu, the uncompetitive market that the government-financed business operates in reinforce structural inefficiencies. In China, who you are and who you know, and whether or not you are part of the party, are more important for the success of any business venture than the product you produce and the service you provide. This patronage system has led to a chabado, or close enough attitude, in China's industries, and like Japan, can lead to widespread financial collapse. And the collapse has already begun. Since the trade conflict with the United States, China's corporations are starting to default on their debt, showing their structural weaknesses. In 2018, state and private firms missed payments on about $15.8 billion, and last year, in 2019, Chinese bond issuers defaulted on roughly $18.5 billion of debt. The year 2020 will surely be even worse. Even without the complete collapse of the international trading system that China's firms so heavily rely on, the rate of bond default in China was supposed to be even higher as more debt reached maturity. There has even been fear that many mid-sized Chinese banks might have too many toxic assets. According to the Financial Times, S&P has warned that up to 11.5% of total loans in the commercial banking system, or about $2.1 trillion, could become questionable, either non-performing or late. That could eventually deplete the sector's regulatory capital buffers, leaving some lenders vulnerable to liquidity shocks. These liquidity shocks are something that could be happening more in China. Not only is China nearing a total debt to GDP ratio of 310%, but like Japan, China is in the midst of a demographic crisis. China, like Japan in the mid-20th century, has had a young and financially savvy workforce that saves because it must. Retirement is totally up to their savings, the healthcare system is abysmal, and there is very little welfare state support, especially if an individual is from the countryside. Also, like Japan, the Chinese saver is aging. 40 years after the one-child policy, China has seemed to run out of 40-year-olds. The average Chinese citizen was set to overtake the average American in age this year. Unlike Japan, China has aged well before it became wealthy, making aging in China much more deadly to its prosperity. As it stands now, China is still a developing economy, with the largest percentage of GDP being investment. Consumption as a percentage of GDP is only around the mid to upper 30 percentile in China, and with a decreasing population, consumption-led growth will be impossible, preventing it from becoming a modern, mature economy. Despite the leaps it has taken in the last 40 years, China's economy is still incredibly poor. As I have mentioned in my previous entry, China has an incredible division between its urban coastal centers and its interior rural ones, and its urban centers tend to skew the perception of China's affluence. The average household income for urban China is about $4,500 a year, a huge improvement from what it once was, but still incredibly poor. However, that income is still much greater than the half of the population that lives in the rural households, which earn about $1,400 a year, or about $4 a day. This has left over half the Chinese population behind. So far, China has rebuffed social discontent by its surging economy and job opportunities. Slowing economic growth will devastate the remaining release valve of economic anxiety And since China's regime is a regime whose mandate comes from prosperity, this will surely foment unrest and quite possibly ignite a revolutionary movement. Although it has been economically stagnant for decades, Japan's society has persisted without a revolutionary movement. The Japanese ruling elite, unlike mainland China's, do not obtain their legitimacy from the prosperity of the nation, but rather the democratic system they uphold for the Japanese people. Their society, although economically fragile because of its rigidity, is politically robust and able to ebb and flow with the currents of history. China is not like Japan. The political corruption and state-mandated allocation of capital makes the CCP's economy even more fragile than Japan's. And unlike Japan, China's political system relies on a promise that has never been achieved: perpetual prosperity. Many have touted that China's efficient authoritarian government and efficient liberal market was the perfection of the totalitarian state. However, the political chimera that China experiences has not yet brought it prosperity and has driven it into debt with many structural inefficiencies. The political chimera that China experiences has not only brought it economic risks, but a political one.